and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to Wilmington, North Carolina and Boston, Massachusetts. And we're going to be looking at a young man, Chris, who had a really big impact on the world of the early 19th century.
Yeah, and what makes this individual so unique is he wrote one pamphlet.
Yeah.
And that one pamphlet has been described as, quote, for a brief and terrifying moment, the most notorious document in America. And so this used clothing salesman will produce this pamphlet that will literally rock the nation and also have a little bit to say about some of the founding fathers and the whole idea of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, and this young man, of course, is David Walker. Let's just give a little background on David Walker. He was born, and birthdays are sort of hard to get at with someone like David Walker. His father was enslaved in Wilmington, North Carolina. His mother was a free woman. Most believe he was born 1785, 1786, somewhere like that, in Wilmington, North Carolina. Now, for those who do not know, the black codes or slave codes generally defined a person's status based on the status of their mother. So because his mom was a free black woman in the South, he was also free. He was not enslaved. But lest we think that meant he had a wonderful life in Wilmington, he did not. I want to go through some things, Chris, about life for free blacks in North Carolina around the time of his birth and later on. So, for example, in 1826, the North Carolina legislature passed a law. Of course, this is just a few years before his death, and so this wouldn't have directly affected him. But it did pass a law that no free black could enter the state of North Carolina. In 1835, free blacks lost all rights to vote in North Carolina, regardless of how much land they may or may not have owned. They were not allowed to preach in public. Again, we're not talking about slaves here. We're talking about free blacks. They could not own a gun without a special permit. They were not allowed to buy or sell alcohol. They were not allowed to attend the public schools, such as those were in the South in the antebellum period. In 1881, a law was passed that free blacks in North Carolina could not own or control a slave. And another law was passed that said if a slave was freed in North Carolina, one of two things had to happen. Either A, they had to leave the state within a period of 90 days, or B, their former master must put up a bond of $500, basically stating that they were worthy to stay in the state. And Chris, if you look at this list of things that free blacks were not allowed to do, this is not only just an attempt to control them, this is an attempt to prevent them from helping their fellow people who are enslaved from getting freedom. You notice something like they could not own or control a slave. One of the things people did once they got out of slavery, sometimes they were able to make some money, and they would go back and they would buy relatives, they would buy spouses, children out of slavery, and then technically they would own that person, but they were basically just buying them to free them. And that was against the law in antebellum North Carolina. And I think you see, Chris, across the South, as we march closer and closer to the Civil War in the 1860s, the rules for slaves and the rules for free blacks are only going to get tougher and tougher as time goes on. And what is going to happen with David Walker is only going to make those rules even tougher as we get into the 19th century.
Yeah, and I think, every single one of those instances that you mentioned is as a result of David Walker, this individual who was a very staunch Christian, but who also had this really strong belief because of his Christianity about what was right and what was wrong. And in his eyes, slavery was an injustice. It was horrible. And so as he begins to speak out about this, you start seeing where the slaves, David Walker is an inspiration for hope. He is this model for, yes, everything's going to be okay. We should be prideful people. And so for the slaves, they look at David Walker as a hero. But to the plantation owners, to the whites of the South, they're scared of this guy. And they're scared of his writings and his, what they would say, radical views. And so they fear that there might be an uprising, that there might be this revolt. And so they have to do something that's going to restrict, whether you're free or whether you're a slave, a Black individual, from being able to move about. So this is an extremely dangerous time period in our history that I don't think many people really focus on. We talk a lot about the horrors of slavery and the injustices of slavery. And individuals like David Walker, who were willing to stand up for what they believed, has a lasting influence on the ongoing struggle for equal rights as well as for racial justice in the United States even today. So, you mentioned he was born of a slave father. He's got a free mother that makes him free. And he sees all of these laws that will start coming about. But one of the things that really, I think, makes an impact on David Walker at a young age, actually in Wilmington, is he saw firsthand with his own eyes the degradations and injustices of slavery. I remember reading that he was in Wilmington one day and he was forced to watch a young son who was forced by the white plantation owner to whip his mother until he died, or excuse me, until she died. And you can't get that out of your mind. And you are influenced at such an early age, and you're watching this and you're thinking, there is no way on earth that this is good, that this is right. And so he's watching it here in Wilmington. And as he's growing up saying, I'm a free man, but yet I'm still seeing this, something's got to change and somebody's got to do something about it. And so he will begin to use his knowledge, his background, but also his occupation to try to make a difference.
Yeah. And when he's in Wilmington, he's going to leave Wilmington and he's going to travel around the country. And he actually states at some point why he left Wilmington, why he left the South. He says, and I'm quoting here, quote, "If I remain in this bloody land, I will not live long. I cannot remain where I must hear slaves' chains continually and where I must encounter the insults of their hypocritical enslavers," end quote. So he's looking at this situation where he's seeing, like you said, the lady who was beat to death by her son, and he's seeing these things, and he's just horrified at what he's seeing. But on the other hand, he's listening to these people talk, go to church on Sunday and talk about God and talk about salvation, and he just says there's a great gulf between what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. That's why he refers to them as hypocritical enslavers. So he's going to leave Wilmington. He's going to really travel around the country, and he's going to settle in Boston, Massachusetts, where he opens up a shop of secondhand clothing stores. And he really, even before he gets into the anti-slavery movement there in Massachusetts and writes his appeal, he's going to be known as someone who's very quick to help the poor, someone who's very generous and benevolent in his attitude toward the poor and helping people. He's going to marry a young woman known only as Emily. Some people believe she may have been a fugitive or runaway slave herself. And that brings us, Chris, to 1829, September specifically of 1829, when he eventually writes his appeal. Now, this isn't coming out of nowhere. He had gotten involved in local abolition societies there in Massachusetts and in Boston, and that ultimately leads him to write this appeal. It's called Walker's Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world. but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. And Chris, he just lays it on the line in Walker's appeal.
Now, I think this is an extremely important document for individuals to really be aware of. 76 pages. It's a pamphlet where his ideas, his views are going to be put out there, where he demands that there is immediate action to dismantle slavery by white religious leaders, by legislative bodies who are accepting this, who are supporting this. And, and to be able to go out and say, Blacks have the power to end slavery through their own organized efforts. This is unthinkable. This is unspeakable if you really start thinking about the time period for when he is writing this. And Ray, I think it's important that we kind of go back and we understand that he raises all of these issues, that slavery is absolutely wrong and that it is abhorrible and it should not be done. And he uses the core document of freedom in America to make his case. And that is the Declaration of Independence, which discusses life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, but not just focusing on those themes, but he also takes dead aim at the writer of that document and so much more, one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, he really does. He mentions Thomas Jefferson numerous times throughout this article, going back, like you said, to the Declaration of Independence and talking about the Declaration. He actually, if you give me a moment to quote something he says here, he says, quote, "See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear your languages proclaimed to the world July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident that, in all caps, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Compare your own language above, extracted from your Declaration of Independence, with your cruelties and murders inflicted by your cruel and unmerciful fathers, and yourselves on our fathers and on us, men who have never given your fathers or you the least provocation," end quote. I mean, he goes right to the Declaration of Independence. Like you said, he goes right to the author of that Declaration of Independence. And he says, look at your own words, listen to your own language. And he issued warnings throughout this document, Chris. In one particular place, he warned, I think in something of almost prophetic language. He said, and I quote again, that unless you speedily alter your course, you and your country are gone. For God Almighty will tear up the very face of the earth, end quote. And I think you can look at that in retrospect, having now known the history of the Civil War and what was going to take place in the 1860s. In a way, Chris, he was absolutely right that the country was headed to a period of judgment over the issue of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, we go back. He's writing this in 1829. Yeah. Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, 1776. Jefferson writes in Notes on the State of Virginia in 1787, where he speaks of the alleged inferiority of Blacks, and that this is becoming an accepted view that whites are superior than Blacks, and it's accepted in the late 18th century. And so Walker says, listen, it is not allowable to remain silent on these allegations from, he calls Jefferson American Renaissance man. And he says, this man is well educated. This man is extremely smart, but I'm going to speak up. I'm a self-taught man. But what I am sharing with you today is that there is a problem with the moral state of America. And he castigates America. And he calls America this backsliding Christian America because you have misapplied the Christian principles. And he challenges. And this is the moment that really causes the horrified expressions of white individuals in the South when David Walker challenges the slaves to rise up. And he says, if you have to do it violently, do it violently. But it is time for you to break free from the chains, to remove yourself from the depths of the degradation you have been claimed, and you need to claim your freedom. You need to embrace your freedom, and shame on the young republic for not maintaining its ideals of the American Revolution. So Black individuals, wherever you are, rise up. But Ray, there's a problem that we have to think about. Most of these that he's writing to are enslaved, and they have very strict measures that are being put on them. So how does a man from Boston write this pamphlet and then expect to be able to get that pamphlet into the hands of slaves without white plantation owners and other leaders being able to see what's going on? There's an ingenious way that he does that, and it really helps to push his pamphlet forward.
Yeah, he depends on a lot of, I guess we could call it, secret agents. He's there in Boston, of course, near the water, and he actually uses people, and he will sew his appeal into their clothes, and they will go into the South and pass out those pamphlets and get it into the hands of slaves. And actually, it appears for the first time in Wilmington, North Carolina. I think it was in 1830 where it first makes its appearance in Wilmington. And of course, white people are absolutely panicked, whether in Wilmington or Fayetteville or New Bern or Elizabeth City or wherever they are. Panic spreads among these white people because of the message of this appeal, the message of what Walker is saying, like you said, Chris, to rise up, claim your freedom. And I think what David Walker would say is claim your God-given freedom and stand up for that and fight for that. And of course, governor of North Carolina at the time was a man called John Owen, who we've already done a previous episode on. John Owen. He has very, very close ties to southeastern North Carolina. And he actually sends a copy of David Walker's appeal to the state legislature, and the legislature is going to enact some of the most repressive measures against free blacks and slaves ever passed in the history of North Carolina. And I believe I went over some of those a little later as a result of the appearance of Walker's appeal in North Carolina. And I think as you move closer and closer to the Civil War, and the situation gets more and more and more tense, and there's that tension building between the North and the South over the issue of slavery, you can see the level of concern, the level of panic among Southern whites, pro-slavery Southern whites, as they buckle down to protect their peculiar institution.
When we look at this document, and to be honest with you, I think this is a perfect episode for history you didn't know but should, because very few people are probably familiar with David Walker's appeal. But what we can say is, while you might not be familiar with his appeal, I think you're very much aware of the significance of David Walker's appeal. For in my humble view, I think it did three things. I think the first thing that it does is it has a profound impact on the national debate about slavery. I mean, when you're going to call out America and basically say that you have strayed from your roots, that you have ignored the foundation, that you are advocating an unchristian nature about slavery, and doing it with a passion that has never been heard before, all of a sudden, people begin asking themselves, whether white plantation owner, white preacher, white legislator, you begin asking, oh my gosh, am I really doing the right thing in the way that we are sharing that blacks are inferior to whites? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is he pushes the abolition movement to a whole new level. He is basically taking the approach of people such as William Lloyd Garrison, who was kind of well, yes, we need to end slavery, but we need to do it gradually. We need to just take our time. David Walker basically says, no, enough of that. We're done with the gradual approach. It's time to have a new radical direction. And he will actually convince William Lloyd Garrison that it's time to demand immediate emancipation. And then the third thing is that this appeal will inspire and influence a generation of Black leaders of all different backgrounds. I mean, we're talking about individuals such as Frederick Douglass, W.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. And if you listen and if you read any of their writings, you can hear David Walker's appeal, especially if you go and read Frederick Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July, that document. You can really just feel that all of these individuals are saying enough is enough. So there is significant impact that this document will have, not just on the individuals that were living at the time of its publication, which I think it was published 3 times, it was so popular, but you'll see it even today in our society as we continue to deal with the injustices that are being faced in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Walker, David Walker himself understood what he was doing. When he wrote this document and released it into the South, he understood he was lighting a fire that could very easily come back and burn him. You know, there was bounties put on his head, a $3,000 reward for anybody who would, I guess, bring his head in, literally, a $10,000 reward for anybody who would bring him in alive. But he understood the risk, and I think Chris, again, I'm going to quote from his appeal. He understood the danger that he himself was in, and he says, "quote I count my life not dear unto me, that I'm ready to be offered at any moment. For what is the use of living when in fact I am dead? But remember, Americans, that as miserable, wretched, degraded, and abject as you have made us in preceding and in this generation, to support you and your families, that some of you on the continent of America will yet curse the day that you were ever born." End quote. I mean, he understands what he's saying. He understands what he's getting himself into. And Chris, he's willing to take that step despite understanding what he's doing. It sort of reminds me of a statement by the great reformer Martin Luther, who, of course, when he began to protest some of the beliefs and actions of the Roman Catholic Church, he later writes, you know, I didn't know what I was getting into. I did not, this was not my intention. Glad it happened, but this was not my intention. But David Walker wasn't like that at all. He understood very well what he was getting himself into. And he does pass away in 1830. He does pass away there at his home in Boston, where he is found dead. Of course, there's initial suspicion that it was the result of poisoning, that he had been murdered. And certainly that is absolutely possible, that someone got to him and poisoned him, put some poison in his food or whatever. A lot of historians today, however, think he may have died of tuberculosis. But Chris, you know, I think either one of those causes of death are a real possibility for this man, because he did anger a lot of people, number one. And number two, tuberculosis was something that was a big problem at the time.
Yeah, and I think as we look at his life, we are reminded of individuals who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, who are truly a profile in courage. He knew what he was going up against, but he also knew what it meant to have a relationship with God. He understood that you are to love one another, to bear with one another, to forgive one another, to care for one another, to listen to one another. But he also knew that if people were not going to do those things, that he was not to sit idly by, that he needed to make a statement. And he needed to allow people to have an opportunity to claim a dream where individuals could be free and that they could enjoy what had originally been promised that America would be: a land of opportunity, a land where anybody, any color, any size, any education would have the opportunity to go forth and to truly accomplish what God had intended for them to accomplish. David Walker, you know, he does die. What is interesting is that he had one son, Edward Walker, which is pretty interesting because in 1866, Edward Walker becomes the first Black elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. So as we look back and we see his significance, David Walker's appeal did reach to the hearts of many. It didn't change the hearts of a lot, but it did make inroads into trying to bring America back to where it was supposed to be at the beginning.
Yeah, and you mentioned the importance of forgiveness and bringing everybody together. Despite his harsh language, I think that's ultimately what he wanted. Again, I'm going to read a little bit of his appeal. He says, and I quote, "Treat us then like men, and we will be your friends. And there is not a doubt in my mind, but that the whole of the past will be sunk into oblivion, and we yet, under God, will become a united and happy people. The whites may say it is impossible, but remember that nothing is impossible with God," end quote.
Hey, Ray, don't you think that maybe that statement should be put on every billboard, every sign, every Facebook, social media? That quote right there, that's exactly where we are in our society today. If we would just do exactly what David Walker's appeal is saying, I think that we would find ourselves less divisive and more united. And for all of the naysayers, I mean, David Walker was going into the biggest group of naysayers there ever was. But yet he understood, just as those who have faith understand, that if we all work together and if we all believe, we can achieve great things. So I think that quote that you just said should be something that everybody uses and talks about and shares, because that's truth.
Yeah, it's a great way to end the episode as well. Thanks, Chris, for another wonderful episode. I hope our listeners enjoy this. If you would like to contact us with suggestions, comments, you can email us at historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know at gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter. Our podcast is available on Sounder, Spotify, Google Podcast, and other places. I encourage you to share these podcasts with your friends. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Encourage your friends and family to listen. I think you'll learn a lot from the material we're presenting on this podcast. So until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk at you later.